Okay, in this tutorial, what we're going to ask is, what is the final velocity of the projectile right before it hits the ground? So you launch a projectile up, it reaches its maximum height, it comes back down. How fast is it moving right there, the instant before it hits? So what we have to do is realize that right before it hits, that's our projectile, right before it hits the ground, it's moving in two directions at one time. It is moving over, that is the velocity in the x direction at the end of the problem, and it's moving down at the same time. And so if we want to find the final velocity, we have to find this vector right here. That is the vector that shows us the final velocity. Okay? Now, how fast, when it gets right to here, how fast is it moving horizontally? Well, that is the velocity in the x direction at the end of the problem. And that's pretty easy because in the x direction, there's no acceleration. And so the velocity, which we found was 40 meters per second for this problem, is always going to be 40 meters per second. It's never going to change. So in this case, the velocity x final is the same as velocity x initial. It's never going to change. So we know this one right here. This is going to be the velocity in the y direction final. So what we have to do is figure out how fast is the projectile moving downwards at the end of the problem. Okay? So to solve that problem, the first thing we're going to do is this. The velocity in the y direction final equals the velocity in the y direction initial plus the acceleration in the y times the time. So this is one of our equations, and it's pretty easy to find the velocity in the y direction final. Okay? So for this problem, the one I'm solving, where I launch it at 50 meters per second at 36 degrees, the velocity in the y direction initial was 30 meters per second. So this is going to be 30 meters per second plus the acceleration of the y, which is negative 9.81 meters per second squared, times the time, which was 6.12 seconds. And all that tells me that the velocity in the y direction final is negative 30 meters per second. Okay? Which is pretty easy. So that is what we call the velocity in the y direction final. So it turns out that when I plug my numbers in, for this problem, it is moving 40 meters per second horizontally still. It's moving 30 meters per second downwards. And if I want to find the final velocity, I have to add these two velocities, but they're at right angles, so I'm going to use Pythagoras' theorem. And so the final velocity of the projectile will be the final velocity in the x direction squared plus the final velocity in the y direction squared, and then the square root of that. So that when you want to find the final velocity of a projectile, or the velocity at any point in its trajectory, you've got to find the velocity in the x direction at that point, which is pretty easy because it never changes. You've got to find the velocity in the y direction, and the easiest way is probably to use this equation. And then, using the velocity in the x and the y direction, add them as vectors to find the final velocity. Okay? So that'll help you solve the next problem where I ask you for the final velocity.